The knock came before the sky had decided what color it wanted to be, in that hollow hour when even the coyotes had gone quiet, and Harlan Graves had not been asleep anyway. He had been sitting at his kitchen table with a tin cup of cold coffee, staring at the grain of the wood the way a man does when his thoughts have gotten too loud to ignore and too vague to chase down. The stove had burned low. The single oil lamp on the shelf threw a yellowish light across the room that made everything look older than it was, including him. He was 34 years old, and some mornings he felt every year of it like a stone in his boot. The knock was soft at first, almost polite. The kind of knock that apologizes for itself even as it makes itself heard. He did not move immediately. Out here on the eastern edge of the New Mexico territory, in the autumn of 1883, a knock before dawn was not always a good thing. It could be a rider in trouble. It could be someone whose horse had thrown a shoe on the long dark road between Cimarron and Rayado. It could also be something worse, and a man who had lived alone for 3 years on a cattle ranch with no neighbors closer than 4 miles had learned to pause before he reached for the door handle. He did reach for the rifle first, not in a menacing way, just the way you put on your coat before stepping outside. Habit and caution dressed up the same. The second knock came, and this time there was something in it that he could not name, a kind of exhaustion. A sound that was trying very hard to be dignified and barely holding on to the effort. He crossed the plank floor in his stocking feet and opened the door. The woman standing on his porch looked like she had been traveling for a very long time and had finally run out of places to go. She was not young in the way that is careless and unearned, but she was not old either. She was somewhere in the middle of her 30s, with dark eyes that caught the lamplight from inside the house and held it without looking soft. Her hair was dark underneath but threaded through at the temples, and the crown with the silver white of frost, not the kind that comes only from age, but the kind that can come from grief, from winters survived, from years that do not apologize for their weight. It was loose around her shoulders and damp at the ends, which told him she had been out in the cold for longer than was sensible. She wore a wool coat that had once been a fine garment and still tried to act like it. Beneath it he could see the dark hem of a dress, and her boots were caked with red clay mud that did not belong to any road he knew nearby, which meant she had walked cross-country at some point, through the dark, through the cold, through land that did not care about her. She had a small leather traveling bag hanging from one hand. Her other hand was pressed flat against the doorframe, not knocking anymore, just holding herself upright. "I am sorry," she said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her something. He could hear the cost of it. "I know this is an unreasonable hour. My name is Elvira Wells. My horse came up lame 2 miles east on the Cimarron Road. I have been walking since." He looked at her. He looked past her at the black sky beginning to turn a dark bruised blue at the lowest edge. He looked at the mud on her boots and the frost in her hair, and the careful way she was holding herself like a person who has been careful for so long that they have forgotten what it feels like to let go. He stepped back from the door and did not close it again. "Come in," he said. She did not move for one moment that seemed to last longer than it should have. She looked at the open door, and she looked at him, and something passed across her face that he would spend the next several weeks trying to understand. Then she stepped across the threshold, and Harlan Graves's life, which had been very quiet and very settled and very organized in its loneliness, began its slow and irreversible rearrangement. He put her by the stove first. He added wood without speaking, 3 split pieces of cedar that caught fast and threw heat into the room within minutes. He pulled the second chair from the table, the one that never had anyone sitting in it, and set it close to the stove, and she sat in it without being asked twice because she was cold enough that pride could wait. He put the coffee pot on. Real coffee, not the cold gray remnant in his cup. "The horse," he said. He was not a man who wasted words, and she seemed to understand this because she answered the incomplete sentence as if it were complete. "A bay mare. She's standing on the road. I tied her to the fence post at the old Medina property. She was favoring the left front. She won't go far." "I'll go get her in the morning," he said, "when there's light enough to see the ground." She nodded. She pulled her coat tighter around her and then seemed to catch herself doing it and deliberately loosened her grip. A woman practicing the act of being comfortable. He set a mug of hot coffee on the edge of the stove within her reach and took his own back to the table and sat down. He did not pepper her with questions. He had lived long enough in this country to know that a person who had arrived at your door before dawn with frost in their hair had a story they would tell when they were ready to tell it, and pushing before that readiness arrived was both impolite and usually counterproductive. She drank the coffee in slow, careful sips, and the color came back to her face by degrees, the way sunrise comes, without announcement, just incrementally present. After a while she said, "You are Harlan Graves." It was not quite a question. "I am," he said. "I was told in Cimarron that you might be willing to take on a hired hand. A woman came into the dry goods store while I was asking about lodging. She said you had been looking for help since your man Abel Cortez left for Taos in the spring." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn. "That's true. I am looking for work," she said. "I can cook. I can keep accounts. I managed a household in a 40-acre operation for 8 years in Kansas. I know cattle well enough to be useful and horses well enough to be careful with them." She looked at him straight. "I am a widow. My husband, Thomas Wells, died 14 months ago. Fever. The place in Kansas was his brother's in the end, not mine. As it turned out, the deed had never been amended. I have been working my way west and south since March." He heard all of this and held it the way you hold a complex thing at arm's length first to see the shape of it. "You have people?" he asked. "A daughter," she said. "Clara. She is 9 years old. She is in Cimarron at the boarding house run by a woman named Dorothea Lusk. I could not bring her on the road tonight. I left her there this afternoon and told her I would be back within 2 days with either a position secured or enough information to make the next decision." He thought about this. He thought about a 9-year-old girl asleep in a boarding house in Cimarron with her mother out walking through the cold dark across clay fields. He thought about the kind of determination that took. "What did you do before Kansas?" he said. "I grew up in Missouri. My father ran a ferry crossing. I helped him with the books from the time I was 12. I am good with numbers. I am not sentimental about hard work." A pause. "I am not sentimental about much." He nodded slowly. "I run 300 head of cattle. I have a good well. Vegetable garden that's mostly gone to winter now. Chicken house with 16 birds. The main house, which is this one, and a bunkhouse out back that hasn't been occupied since Abel left. It needs sweeping out and fresh bedding, but it's sound. There is a separate room at the end of it that was built for a foreman's family that I never had a foreman with a family. It has a proper door and a window. It's small, but it's private." She was listening carefully, not with the eager nodding of someone desperate, with the attention of someone who was taking in information and measuring it against something. "Your daughter would need to be enrolled in the school in Cimarron," he continued. "The road is 4 miles. On good days you could ride. I have a wagon." "I can drive a wagon," she said. "I expect you can," he said. A long quiet sat between them. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that 2 people fall into when they have each been alone for a long time and have learned to move around silence without disturbing it. "What would the arrangement be?" she said. "In terms of wages?" He named a figure. It was fair. It was not lavish, but it was honest, which she could tell from the way he said it, without hesitation or prelude, the way a man says something he has already decided is right. She looked at the stove. The fire was going well now and the room had warmed considerably. "I accept," she said, not with excitement, with the quiet firmness of someone who has made a decision they intend to keep. "All right," he said. Outside, the dark blue at the edge of the sky was becoming something closer to gray. The birds in the cottonwood trees along the creek had begun to stir, not singing yet, just shifting and muttering to themselves in that preliminary way. He showed her to the bunkhouse and the small room at the end. He lit the lamp for her. He pulled the extra quilt from the cedar chest in the hallway. the one with the blue and white squares that had been his mother's, and set it on the bed without comment. He showed her where the outhouse was, and where he kept the water barrel with the good tin dipper. She stood in the small room with the lamp burning and looked around at it, at the plain walls and the narrow window and the iron bed frame, and he saw something move across her face that she did not try to hide. Not quite relief, not quite sorrow, something that was both of those things at once, the way a person feels when they have been handed something solid after a long time of reaching for things that were not there. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and turned to go, and she said, "Mr. Graves." He turned back. "I am not asking for anything except honest work and honest pay," she said. "I want to make sure that is understood clearly." "It's understood," he said. "Good," she said. And then, so quietly he might have imagined it, "Good." He went back to the main house. He did not go back to sleep. He sat at the table with fresh coffee and watched the sky outside turn from gray to the pale orange pink of early morning, and he thought about the woman in the room at the end of his bunkhouse, and about the frost in her hair and the mud on her boots and the steady, unhurried way she had said she was not sentimental about much. He thought about it for a long time. He went out at first light and found the bay mare exactly where Elvira had said she would be, tied to the old Medina fence post, head hanging, patient in the resigned way that horses get when they know there is nothing to be done about the present situation. He checked the left front leg and found what he expected, a stone bruise most likely, no structural damage, just soreness that needed rest and time. He walked her back slowly, talking to her in the low, steady voice he used with horses, and put her in the small paddock behind the barn with fresh water and hay. He was measuring out oats when he heard the creak of the bunkhouse door. He turned and saw Elvira Wells crossing the yard toward him. She had brushed her hair and pinned it up and changed into a different dress, a gray one with small dark buttons down the front. She moved with a straight-backed purposeful stride that had no performance in it, the stride of a person who goes from place to place because there is something at each place that requires their attention. "How is she?" she said, looking at the mare. "Bruised. She'll need a week's rest. She's not unsound." Elvira went to the paddock fence and put her hand out flat, and the mare came over and pressed her nose against it with a deep, exhausted sigh. "I know," Elvira said softly. "I am sorry I pushed you." He watched her say that to the horse and felt something shift in his chest that was small but noticeable, like a single floorboard settling. "Breakfast," he said, because that was what came out. She looked at him. "I can cook it. You don't have to start today." "Mr. Graves," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite humor but was in the neighborhood of it. "I have been in transit for 7 months. I would genuinely like to do something useful with my hands this morning." He showed her where he kept everything. She moved through his kitchen with a quiet efficiency that was not intrusive, not reorganizing, not criticizing, just learning the geography of the space and adapting to it. She made eggs and salt pork and biscuits from scratch, because she found flour and lard without asking, and she put them in the Dutch oven with the ease of a woman who had been making biscuits since before she had much to say about anything. They ate at the table. The sunlight was coming through the eastern window now, lying in yellow bars across the floor. He had not eaten breakfast with another person at this table in 3 years. The last person had been a man named Cole Dillon who had ridden in looking for work and stayed 4 months before moving on to Colorado. That had been a different kind of companionship, practical and uncomplicated, 2 men eating food and talking about cattle and the weather. This was different, and he knew it was different, and he was not entirely sure what to do with the knowledge. "I need to go to Cimarron this afternoon," she said, "to collect Clara." "Take the wagon," he said. "Your mare needs rest. I'll hitch the gray for you." She looked at him with an expression he would come to recognize over the following weeks as the one she wore when she was recalibrating something, when she had expected less than what she received. "Thank you," she said. It came out differently than it had the night before, less formal, more real. She went to Cimarron in the afternoon with the gray gelding and the wagon, and Harlan spent the hours doing what he would have done on any other day, checking the south fence line where a steer had gotten through last week, hauling water to the cattle tank, splitting wood against the winter that was already showing its teeth at the edges of each morning. But the day felt different. He noticed that he was working with a slight forward lean, the way a person works when they know something is coming later that makes the ordinary hours interesting. They came back at dusk. He heard the wagon first, the creak and rattle of it on the dirt road, and he came out of the barn to see. Elvira was on the seat with the reins in her hands, and beside her, pressed against her side, was a girl of about 9 who looked at the world with her mother's dark eyes and her mother's way of sitting up straight, but who also had something more openly curious in her face, something that had not yet learned to hold itself back. "Mr. Graves," Elvira said as she brought the wagon to a stop. "This is my daughter, Clara." The girl looked at him. "Is that your horse in the paddock?" she said. "The bay one." "That's your mother's horse," he said. "She came up lame last night. She's resting." Clara looked at the paddock with intense concern. "Can I see her?" "Clara," her mother said. "Please," Clara said, with the same quality her mother had of making a short word carry considerable weight. Harlan looked at Elvira. Elvira looked at him. A small thing moved between them in that look, something quick and almost laughing, the first shared amusement, the first tiny thread. "Sure you can," he said. Clara was off the wagon seat before her mother had quite finished climbing down, and she ran to the paddock fence with her braids flying, and Harlan watched her, and thought that a child who worried that immediately about a horse she had never met was probably a child who was going to be all right in this world. The first week was about logistics. Elvira took over the cooking without discussion and without fanfare, simply appearing in the kitchen each morning and each evening, and producing food that was notably better than what Harlan had been feeding himself. He tried on the second day to tell her she did not need to cook for him, that their arrangement was about the accounts and the household management and the general operations. She looked at him with a patience that was also a kind of firmness. "Mr. Graves, the most efficient use of the stove is to cook for all 3 of us at the same meal. It would be a waste of wood and time to do otherwise. This is not charity. It is simple logic." He could not argue with simple logic. He tried not to think about how different his kitchen smelled now. Clara enrolled in the school in Cimarron at the beginning of the following week. Elvira drove her in the wagon the first morning, and on the second morning Clara stood in the yard with her lunch pail and her book slate and looked at her mother and said, "I can go alone." "You are 9 years old," her mother said. "I know the road," Clara said. "I went it twice already. It is straight and flat and there are no wolves. There are sometimes wolves." "I will carry the long stick," Clara said, indicating the walking stick that Harlan had cut from a cedar branch and set by the bunkhouse door for exactly this kind of argument, though he had not known at the time that this was what he was doing. Elvira looked at the stick. She looked at her daughter. She looked at Harlan, who was very carefully not getting involved. "I will drive you until the first frost is fully off the road," Elvira said. "After that we will reassess." Clara accepted this compromise with the graciousness of someone who knows they have essentially won. By the end of the second week, Harlan had established a rhythm with Elvira that felt remarkable in its naturalness. She handled the household accounts and supply lists with a precision that made him realize, not without some embarrassment, how loosely he had been managing things since Abel left. She found 3 places where he had been consistently overpaying for goods from the dry goods merchant in Cimarron, not through dishonesty on anyone's part, just through the kind of inattention that creeps in when there is no one checking the sums. She reorganized his supply shed in a way that made everything findable, which she did one Saturday while he was out with the cattle, and he came back to find it done. And he stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at the neat order of it and felt something that was partly practical appreciation and partly something softer that he did not examine directly. He came in for supper that night and said, "You didn't have to do the shed." She was at the stove. "It needed doing," she said without turning around. The sugar and the salt were in identical sacks on the same shelf. That is a recipe for catastrophe. It is, he agreed. She turned then and looked at him across the kitchen, ladle in hand, and something about the way she was standing, easy and purposeful, in his kitchen in the lamplight with her hair coming loose from its pins in the steam from the stove, made the breath come in and go out of him differently than usual. He sat down at the table and said nothing about it. October deepened into a cold that had edges to it, and one evening after Clara had gone to bed in the small room and the lamp in the main house was burning low, Elvira stayed at the kitchen table longer than usual. She had been going over the winter supply list, and she had a pencil in her hand and a small frown of concentration between her brows. Harlan was mending a bridle at the other end of the table, which he had been doing for 45 minutes and had made very little progress on because he kept looking up. "You are going to run short of lamp oil before March," she said, without looking up from her list. "I usually do," he said. She wrote something. "I will add 2 extra gallons to the next order from Springer, and more coffee. You go through coffee at a rate that suggests you may be watering your stove with it." "I don't sleep well," he said. She looked up. It was the first personal thing he had said without being asked. She held his eyes for a moment with a directness that did not push, but also did not look away. "I don't either," she said. And then after a pause, "Since Thomas died, I've spent more time awake in the dark than I care to add up." He turned the bridle strap over in his hands. "Was it sudden, the fever?" 11 days, she said. "He was strong in the morning and sick by suppertime and gone 11 days after." "There is nothing sudden about 11 days, and yet somehow you still find yourself unprepared." He nodded. He understood something about being unprepared for loss, though his had been different in shape. "My wife," he said slowly, because it was not something he usually said aloud, "died in the winter of 1880. Childbirth, the baby too, a boy." He looked at the table. "I have been out here since then. I came west because I needed to be somewhere that didn't have the shape of her in every room." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the particular understanding that passes between two people who have both known that specific weight. "Did it help?" she said quietly. "Coming west?" He thought about it honestly. "After a while," he said. "Slowly," she nodded. She looked back at her list, but the quality of the room had changed, become something more intimate than it had been before, the way a room changes when 2 people in it have spoken honestly without the armor on. November brought the first real snow, not a dusting but a proper several-inch fall that came overnight and turned the land white and simple. Clara woke up to it and stood in the yard in her nightgown until her mother pulled her in scolding, but not harshly, and the sound of their voices carrying through the cold morning air, the mother's firm warmth and the child's delighted protest, was something Harlan stood on his porch and listened to without meaning to, and did not want to stop. He took Clara out after breakfast to see the cattle. He had not planned it. She had asked if she could come when she saw him going to the barn, and he had said yes before he thought about it. She walked beside him in her coat with the wool collar and her rubber-soled boots from the dry goods store, chattering with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has decided someone is trustworthy. "My papa used to take me to see the cattle in Kansas," she said. "But those were dairy cattle. They were very gentle. Are yours gentle?" "Some of them," he said. "Some of them are stupid and some are mean and most of them are somewhere in the middle." She considered this. "Like people," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Like people," he agreed. "Mama says you are a good man," she said, with the complete lack of social filter that is the gift and occasional peril of 9-year-olds. He did not know what to do with that, so he opened the pasture gate and pointed out the herd, and told her the names of the ones he had names for, which was more of them than he generally admitted to, because a man who has been alone long enough starts naming things as a way of having something to address. She listened to all of it and asked sensible questions, and when they walked back she put her small mittened hand into his, the way children do without considering whether it is welcome, just assuming it is, and he let it stay there, and something in him that had been a closed fist for 3 years opened one finger. It was a Friday in mid-November when the situation at the Cimarron Merchant came to a head. Elvira had gone into town for the weekly supplies, and when she came back she was tighter in the face than usual, which he had come to recognize as her particular form of controlled irritation. She set the supplies down in the kitchen and then set her hands flat on the table. "The merchant, Mr. Stokes," she said. "What about him? He has been telling people in town that I am your housekeeper." She paused. In a tone that implies something other than housekeeping, Harlan felt a slow heat rise behind his ears. "I see. He made a remark when I was at the counter that I will not repeat, but that I think you can imagine the nature of. There were 3 other women in the store. One of them laughed." He stood up from the table. "Sit down," she said. "I am telling you as information, not as a summons." He sat down because her voice had that quality of genuine authority that he had learned in a relatively short time was worth respecting. He thought about what he wanted to say and then said it plainly. "I'll speak to Stokes." "I have already spoken to Stokes," she said. "I told him that I am the household manager and accounts keeper for the Graves Ranch, that my daughter is enrolled in the school and is a member of this community, and that if he repeated his remark or anything like it, I would take my business to Springer and make certain my reasons for doing so were publicly known." He looked at her. The color was up in her face and her eyes were bright with the residue of anger, but her voice was completely level. "What did he say?" he said. "He said nothing. He wrapped my order." Harlan thought about Stokes and his remark and the women who laughed, and he thought about Elvira standing at that counter alone and delivering her response without flinching, and the admiration that moved through him was too large and too specific to be the ordinary kind. "He will not do it again," Harlan said. "No," she agreed. "He will not." He went to town the following Monday anyway, not in anger, not with drama, just in the way of a man who is going to have a direct and private conversation with another man about the requirements of basic human decency. He was not gone long. When he came back, he said only that the matter was concluded, and Elvira looked at him across the kitchen, and he could see that she understood exactly what had happened and was deciding how she felt about it. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, with those dark eyes that held everything in them without showing their whole hand, and then she went back to her work. But he noticed that, when she passed him to reach the upper shelf, she did not give as wide a berth as she usually did, and there was something in that small adjustment, that narrowing of space, that he felt distinctly in the place where his ribs came together. December arrived with a cold that was serious and intentional. The nights dropped well below freezing, and the days were not much kinder, and the work of keeping a cattle operation running through a New Mexico territory winter was demanding and physical and constant. Harlan was up before light every morning and often not back in the house until well after dark, and Elvira always had food waiting always, and always had the lamp in the window, and he had stopped pretending to himself that this was merely practical. One evening, he came in from a long, difficult day in which 2 heifers had needed pulling through difficult deliveries, and one had not survived, and he was cold through to the center of him, and tired in his hands and his back, and in the place behind his eyes where fatigue accumulates when you have been working too long without rest. He sat down at the table and did not speak immediately, and she set his supper in front of him, and then, without asking and without preamble, she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him and drank hers and said nothing at all. He ate. The food was warm and good. The lamp burned. The stove ticked. After a while he said, "Lost a heifer today." "I know," she said. "I saw you come back." He looked at his coffee cup. "The other one is all right, the calf too, small but strong." "Good," she said, another silence. Then he said, "You didn't have to sit up." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her then fully in the way he had been mostly avoiding, because looking at her fully in the lamplight was something that had consequences he was not entirely prepared to manage. She looked back. She was not performing anything. She was not being soft or strategic or mysterious. She was just there in the way that a real person is there, with her real tiredness and her real warmth and her real capacity to sit quietly with another person who needed company they had not asked for. Elvira, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Something crossed her face, quick and then controlled, but he saw it. Yes, she said, and her voice was level. I need to tell you something, he said. Because I think it is honest, and because I think you are a person who values honesty, and because I do not want to be the kind of man who says nothing and lets something become misunderstood. She set down her cup and gave him her full attention. I think a great deal of you, he said. A great deal. I think it began before I had permission to, and I have been trying to be careful about it because of the position you are in, working here, and because I do not want you to feel any kind of pressure that you should not feel. So I want to say it clearly and then tell you just as clearly that nothing needs to change between us if this is not something you have any interest in. Your work here is your own, and your place here is your own. That will not change regardless. She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he had made a significant error. Then she said, I moved Clara to the room at the end of the bunkhouse. The room that's private, because I thought it was wise at the start of all this to keep a clear distance. He waited. I have been telling myself for some weeks now that the reason I keep the lamp on is for practicality, she said, that I am simply a thorough and attentive housekeeper. He said nothing. I am not, she said, merely a thorough and attentive housekeeper. The silence between them after that was different in character from any silence they had yet shared. It was full of something warm and tentative and real, like a new fire just caught, still finding its shape. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. His hand was large and rough and scarred along the knuckle of the right thumb from a wire fence incident in the summer. Her hand was smaller but not soft, a working woman's hand, and she turned it under his and held back. They stayed like that for a while, not speaking, just the two of them in the lamplight with the cold pressing at the windows and the stove burning warm and true. He said, I have not been this person in a long time. She said, neither have I, he said. We can go slowly. She said, I would like that. He squeezed her hand once and let go, and she stood and collected the cups and washed them, and he sat and watched the stove, and the night was very quiet and very full. Christmas in 1883 came to the Graves ranch without fanfare and with considerable warmth. Clara had made paper decorations for the front window of the main house, which Elvira had pretended not to notice her doing, but had acquired the colored paper from Springer on a supply run, so the pretense was somewhat transparent on both sides. Harlan cut a small pine from the hillside 2 days before the holiday, which was not a thing he had done in several years, and brought it in and set it in the corner of the main room without explaining why. And Clara made small ornaments for it out of paper and ribbon and bits of colored thread. And in the evenings, she would tell him the significance of each one, as if he were being given a guided tour of an important exhibition. On the morning of Christmas itself, he came in from the early chores to find Elvira at the stove with a tall pot that smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, and she had made a sweetened corn pudding that was apparently a tradition from her Missouri childhood, and she had it on the table with honey and a tin of crackers and the last of the hard cheese from before the cold set in. It was not a lavish spread, but the table was set with the good cloth that had been in the cedar chest, and Clara had put a sprig of dried juniper in the center, and the tree was in the corner with its handmade ornaments, and the lamp was lit even though the morning sun was coming through the window. And when Harlan stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at this scene, he had to stop moving for a moment. Elvira turned from the stove and saw him standing there, and she saw his face, and she did not say anything. She just looked at him with those steady dark eyes that held everything carefully and offered what they had. He crossed the kitchen and stood close to her, closer than they had stood before, and he said in a low voice, "Thank you." She looked up at him. "For breakfast?" "For all of it," he said. She reached up and adjusted the collar of his coat, which was turned up on one side, the same small domestic gesture that a person makes when they are entitled to make it, when it is their right to straighten what is crooked about someone. She smoothed it flat. She looked at her own hand for a moment where it rested against the worn wool of his collar, and then she looked up at him again. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, gentle and deliberate, the way you kiss something you are afraid of breaking, except she was not a breakable thing. She was a woman who had walked 2 miles through the dark with frost in her hair, and she did not break. She put her forehead against his jaw for one moment, just one, and then Clara's feet were on the floor in the other room, and the moment arranged itself back into its ordinary shape. But the shape of the ordinary had changed. January brought a blizzard that closed the road to Cimarron for a week, and trapped the 3 of them together in the ranch with a kind of enforced intimacy that was not unpleasant. They played card games by the stove after supper. Clara beat them both at every game she was taught, with a competitive serenity that was extraordinary to witness. Elvira read aloud from the books on the shelf, some of which Harlan had not opened in years, and her reading voice was clear and unhurried, with just enough feeling in it to carry the story without editorializing. On the 4th evening of the blizzard, with the wind pressing hard against the house and the temperature outside at something well below what a person wanted to be in, Harlan found himself telling her about the ranch before, about the early days when he had first come west, about how he had built the main house over 2 summers, and how he had found the cedar chest at a market in Santa Fe and carried it home in the back of the wagon because something about it seemed important to have. She told him about the ferry crossing on the Missouri River, about her father, who was a stern and decent man who had taught her to look at numbers as if they were a language, not an obstacle, about how she had met Thomas Wells at a harvest gathering in 1872 when she was 22 and he was 24, and how she had known within 2 conversations that he was a man worth knowing, though knowing and keeping were, as it turned out, not always within your power. They talked until late. Clara had been asleep for hours. "Do you regret it?" he said, "coming all this way to a stranger's door?" She looked at the fire. "Ask me in the spring," she said, and there was a smile in it. He smiled too, and it was a thing that sat easily on his face, which surprised him a little because he had not been in the habit of smiling. In February, a man came to the ranch looking for work, a lean, hard-faced young man named Deke Mossman, who had a letter of reference from a ranch up in Colorado that said he was reliable. Harlan looked at the letter and looked at the man and talked to him for half an hour, and then told him he would think about it. After Mossman rode back toward Cimarron to wait for an answer, Elvira appeared in the barn doorway. "Well," she said, he was brushing down the gray gelding, "you heard the conversation." "I was not eavesdropping," she said. "I was mending harness at the bench 4 feet away. There is a difference." He ran the brush in long strokes. "The reference is good. He knows cattle. He's young." "He is," she said, 23 or so. He seemed honest. "He seemed nervous," he said. "Young men looking for work are often nervous." He stopped brushing. "You think I should hire him?" "I think you need the help," she said. "You have been doing the work of 2 men since Abel left. It is wearing on you." He looked at her. She met his eyes steadily, as she always did, without flinching or softening what she said, simply because it might not be easy to hear. "You noticed," he said. "I have been noticing you every day for 4 months," she said, and then she seemed to register what she had said, and a very slight warmth moved into her cheeks that she did not try to cover. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I know you have." He hired Deke Mossman. The young man proved to be exactly what his letter said he was, reliable and quiet and competent with cattle, and he moved into the main bunkhouse room without any drama, and went about his work with the head-down diligence of someone who understood that work was the thing that made you reel out here. March came, and with it mud and the first real thaw and the particular smell of wet earth and cedar that Harlan had always loved. The cattle were restless with the warming. The calves that had been born through the difficult winter were growing strong. The kitchen garden needed turning over and planting. He and Elvira went out one Saturday morning to turn the garden, both of them with spades, working the rows in parallel. The sun was warm on his back for the first time in months. Clara was in Cimarron at school. Deke was out with the cattle. It was very quiet except for the birds and the distant sound of the creek. They worked without speaking for a while, which was one of the things he had come to understand about her. She was not a woman who talked to fill silence. She talked when she had something to say, and she was quiet when she did not, and these two things were equally and comfortably present. He said, eventually, "I have been thinking." She kept working. "About what?" "About asking you something," he said, "that I have been not asking for some time." She stopped. She looked at him across the turned earth, with the spade in her hands and the spring light on her face and the frost long gone from her hair in the warmth of the morning. "Elvira," he said. He drove his spade into the soft earth and left it there and turned to face her fully. "I have been a solitary man for a long time. I have been content with that solitude, or at least I believed I was, until the morning you knocked on my door and I understood, without being able to say it yet, that content and alive are not the same thing." She was very still. "I love you," he said. "I love you in the way that I did not think I would love anyone again, and I love Clara, and I love the way this place feels now, with you both in it. And I am asking if you are willing, if you would consider marrying me. Not because it is practical, though it is practical, and not because of what anyone in Cimarron thinks or says, but because I want to spend the rest of my life with you. And I want to say so plainly, in the sunlight, in the garden, with mud on my boots." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved across the field and lifted a strand of hair from her forehead. "Harlan," she said, and she said his name the way you say a word you have been thinking quietly for a long time before you say it aloud. "Yes," he said. "I told Clara this morning that I thought you might ask," she said. He stared at her. "You told Clara?" "She is perceptive," Elvira said. "She has been asking me questions about you since November that were not subtle. I thought it was fair to prepare her." "What did she say?" he said. Something moved across Elvira's face that was full and warm and luminous. "She said, and I am quoting exactly, 'Good. He knows which of the cows are mean. That is important.'" He laughed. It came out of him fully and freely. The laugh of a man who has been handed something unexpected and wonderful. And she laughed too, not loudly but deeply. The laugh of someone releasing something they have been holding very carefully, and the sound of it went out across the garden and the field and the March sky. When the laughter had settled, she stepped across the turned row between them and put both her hands on either side of his face, and he put his hands at her waist, and she looked at him with everything she had never once tried to perform or pretend, all of it present in her dark eyes in the spring light. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Harlan Graves." He kissed her then, fully and honestly, there in the garden in the mud of early spring, with the birds calling in the distance, and the smell of turned earth around them, and the whole long winter behind them, and all the warm and open seasons of the life they were choosing waiting ahead. They were married in May. The ceremony was held in Cimarron at the small church that was also used as a meeting hall on weekdays, officiated by the minister, Reverend Aldrich Cole, who was a sparse and serious man with a kind interior that showed when he talked to people. He shook Harlan's hand and looked him in the eye and seemed to find what he needed to find there. Elvira wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the winter evenings, working by lamplight after Clara was asleep, and Harlan had not known she was making it until he saw her in it on the morning of the wedding, coming across the yard with Clara beside her, and he had been required to look at the middle distance for a moment before he could trust his own face. Clara was their witness, along with Deke Mossman, who stood with his hat in his hands and a look of genuine moved solemnity that Harlan found touching without saying so. The merchant Stokes was not in attendance, having made the sensible decision that his presence would not be welcome. Several of the women from the town were there, including Dorothea Lusk from the boarding house where Clara had stayed in October, who cried openly and did not apologize for it. Reverend Cole read the words, and Harlan said what he was supposed to say and meant every syllable of it, and Elvira said what she was supposed to say in her clear and level voice. and when he put the ring on her finger, a simple silver band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe who made them to specification and shipped them by post, she looked at it on her hand for a moment that he could not interpret, and then looked up at him, and he could interpret that. After the ceremony, there was a dinner at the meeting hall that the women of the town had organized without much input from either Harlan or Elvira, which was perhaps how it should be. There was roasted beef and corn and bread, and a cake with white sugar frosting that Clara ate 2 pieces of and had to be restrained from a third. Deke danced with one of the young women from the dress shop in Cimarron and turned a shade of red that Harlan took note of for future comment on a more appropriate occasion. Elvira danced with him, there in the meeting hall with the fiddle playing and the lanterns lit, and the whole small community around them. She danced well, with the same unhurried confidence she brought to everything, and she looked up at him as they moved through the pattern of the dance with an expression that was uncomplicated and radiant and his. They drove home in the wagon in the early evening with Clara asleep in the back, wrapped in the blue quilt, her cheek on her arms, utterly unconscious in the way of children who have used everything they have. The road home was long and quiet in the fading light, and Elvira sat beside him with her shoulder against his arm and her hands loose in her lap, and the country around them was May green and wide, and full of the particular sweetness of an evening that has been earned. "Elvira Graves," he said, very quietly so as not to wake Clara. She looked up at him. "It will take me some time to answer to that." "Take all the time you need," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he shifted the reins to one hand, and they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was full to the edges with everything they had chosen. The summer of 1884 was a working summer in the way that all summers on a cattle ranch are working, long and physical and full of the small crises and daily satisfactions of keeping a living operation alive and growing. But it was also a summer that had a quality Harlan struggled to name precisely, a quality that had something to do with having a reason to come home at the end of the day that was more than just food and sleep. Elvira expanded the kitchen garden and was systematic about it in the way she was systematic about everything, with a ledger in which she tracked what was planted and when and what yield she expected and what she got. She was right more often than wrong. By July, the garden was producing more than the 3 of them needed, and she began trading surplus vegetables in Cimarron, negotiating with the same calm authority she brought to every commercial interaction, and using the income to build a small reserve fund for the ranch operations. He watched her do this and felt an admiration that had passed well beyond what could be reasonably categorized as the practical appreciation of an employer for a competent employee. She was extraordinary. She was extraordinary in a way that she seemed entirely unaware of, which was one of the things that made it so absolute. One evening in late July, he came in from a long day to find her at the kitchen table with the account books and 2 oil lamps burning close together, and a look of fierce concentration on her face that he recognized as her problem-solving expression. "What is it?" he said. "The north fence line repair is going to cost more than I had in the estimate," she said. "We can absorb it if we wait on the new water trough, or we can do both if we sell the 4 steers I had flagged for fall rather than spring." He sat down and looked at the figures. She had laid them out clearly, 3 options with their respective costs and consequences written in her neat small hand. "If we sell now, the price is lower," he said. "By about 12%, she said, "but the trough is needed. The cattle are crowding the east one, and there have been 2 injuries in the last month from it." He looked at the figures and looked at her and thought about the fact that this woman had arrived at his door 10 months ago with a stone-bruised horse and a leather bag and her daughter, and had proceeded, without drama or credit-seeking, to make his ranch more solvent, more organized, and considerably more alive than it had been in years. "Sell the steers," he said. "Fix the fence and build the trough." She made a note in the ledger. He reached across the table and covered her hand briefly, and she turned it over and squeezed back without looking up from her writing, with the ease of someone who has stopped having to think about these things. In August, Elvira told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning in the kitchen before Clara was up, speaking in the same direct and level voice she used for everything, but with something underlying it that he recognized not from her, because he had not known her when this was true before, but from the quality of the care with which the words were placed, the way you put something fragile down. He sat down on the kitchen bench, hard. She looked at him with careful attention. "Harlan." "Yes," he said. His voice had done something it rarely did. It had gone soft. "This is the part where you say something," she said, and there was a tremble at the edge of it that she was managing very precisely. He stood up again. He went to her and put his hands on either side of her face the way she had done to him in the garden in March, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and her eyes were bright with the effort of being steady. "How far?" he said. 2 months, she said, "I think. I will have the doctor in Cimarron confirm it." He put his forehead against hers. He held her face very gently, the way you hold something that contains everything. "Elvira," he said. "Yes," she said, and her voice, for the first time since that knock before dawn, was not fully steady. "I am so happy," he said. "I am so happy that I do not have the right words for it." She made a sound that was neither a laugh nor a sob but had elements of both, and she put her hands over his where they held her face, and they stood like that in the kitchen in the August morning light while the birds were going outside and Clara was beginning to stir in her room. Dr. Vance in Cimarron confirmed it. "April," he said. "Give or take 2 weeks, which was as precise as medicine allowed in 1884 in the New Mexico Territory. They told Clara that evening after supper. She sat across the table from them with her hands folded in front of her and listened to the whole explanation and then said, "I knew something was happening because you have been looking at each other more than usual." "We look at each other regularly," Elvira said. "More than regular," Clara said. "I am not upset. I just want to know if I can name it." "Name it," Harlan said. "The baby," Clara said. "If it is a boy, I would like to name it Samuel. I have been thinking about it since last Tuesday." "And if it is a girl," Elvira said. Clara thought about this. "Also Samuel. It can go both ways. I've decided." Harlan and Elvira looked at each other over the table, and the shared laughter that moved between them was quiet and warm and full of love, the specific kind of love that grows in the small moments between two people who have each survived enough to know what the small moments are really worth. Autumn came and the pregnancy went well. Elvira slowed down incrementally but never stopped, redistributing the heavier tasks with practical efficiency and no complaint, accepting help from Deke with the supply wagon without making a production of it, and from Harlan with everything else that needed doing without any of the difficulty. Some women who are accustomed to self-sufficiency have in accepting assistance. She did accept it. She accepted it in the way she accepted everything that was genuinely offered, with directness and grace, and without the diminishment that comes from feeling like acceptance is a debt. One October evening, the anniversary of her first arrival, he waited until Clara was in bed and Deke was in the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, and he brought out the cedar chest from the corner of the bedroom where it lived. She looked at it from the rocking chair he had moved to the fireside because her back was aching more in the evenings now. "What are you doing with the chest?" she said. He set it in front of her. He sat down on the floor beside it, which made her look at him with an expression that had both amusement and warmth in it. "It was my mother's," he said. "She brought it west from Ohio when she was 24 years old and newly married and didn't know what was coming. She kept things in it that mattered to her." He opened the lid. Inside was the blue and white quilt which she knew. Beneath it was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and beneath that a Bible with a soft cover, and beneath that a tin brooch with a blue painted center. "I want you to have it," he said. "Not because you need it or because it obligates you to anything, but because you are the person in this house who understands what is worth keeping." She was very quiet. She looked at the chest and then at him, sitting on the floor beside it with his long legs folded, and his big hands resting on his knees and his face completely open in the firelight. No armor, no distance, just him. "Harlan," she said softly. "I know it is a chest," he said. "I am not trying to make it more than a chest." "It is not only a chest," she said. She put her hand out and touched the edge of the lid. "It is a very significant chest. It is the chest you opened on our first morning." He looked at her. "I did. I watched you go to it," she said. "At 4 in the morning in your stocking feet to get me a quilt. And I thought before I went asleep, this is a man who knows where the warmth is kept." He held her gaze for a moment that was full and still and completely real. "I know where it is now," he said. She reached down and touched his face once lightly, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm briefly, and they sat together by the fire in the October house with the cedar chest open between them and the life they had built around them. And the world outside was cold and wide and full of its particular frontier difficulties, its distances and its silences and its frontier hardness, and none of that was untrue. But this was also true. This was also real and present and solid as the cedar and the stone, and the good red clay of the land. A week into November, a situation arose that required Harlan to go to Springer for 3 days to address a matter with the land office, a boundary question with a neighboring range that had been simmering since summer and needed a proper legal resolution before it became something worse. He did not want to go. He said as much. "You have to go," Elvira said. "If Tanner files his claim first, you lose the Northeast section. You cannot lose the Northeast section. The best winter grass is on the Northeast section. I do not want to leave you," he said plainly. She looked at him with a practical love that was also utterly sincere. "I am 5 months along, not incapacitated. Deke is here. Clara is here, I am here. The ranch will stand for 3 days without you. The cattle, Deke knows what to do. You have shown him everything 3 times. The weather, Harlan," she put her hand on his arm. "Go to Springer, file the paperwork, come back, I will be here." He went to Springer. He resolved the land dispute in 2.5 days with the same methodical directness he brought to everything, secured the boundary with the clerk at the land office, and turned around to come home a day ahead of schedule because the business was done, and there was nothing in Springer that interested him. He rode through the last miles in the late afternoon with the light going gold on the mesa and the smell of the land settling into its evening state around him, that familiar smell of cedar and dust and the particular dry sweetness of New Mexico autumn. He pushed the horse a little in the last stretch, not urgently, just with intention. He came over the last rise and saw the ranch below him in the long light, the main house with its porch and the barn and the bunkhouse and the kitchen garden, all of it exactly as he had left it, and the lamp already lit in the front window because the sun was going down. He saw Elvira in the yard before he reached the gate. She was standing by the fence of the small paddock, just standing, with her coat on and her hair loose in the evening wind, looking out across the field. She had not heard him yet. She was just there in the late light, with one hand resting on the top fence rail, and her face turned to the west where the sky was going orange and rose and deep blue in sequence. He stopped the horse on the road and looked at her for a moment. Just looked. The widow who had knocked at his door before dawn. The woman with frost in her hair and mud on her boots who had asked for honest work and honest pay, and had given him, in return, something he had not known to ask for. He rode through the gate and she turned at the sound of the hooves. "You are early," she said. "Business was done," he said. He dismounted. He looped the reins over the post and came to her, and she stood where she was and let him come, and when he reached her he put both arms around her and she put both hands against his chest, and they stood in the last of the evening light with the field in front of them and the house behind them. "Everything all right," she said against his coat. "Everything is exactly right," he said. She turned her face up and he kissed her, unhurried and certain, and the wind moved across the field, and the lamp burned in the window, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, a single bird was making itself heard against the darkening sky. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was long but not brutal, the kind of winter that tests without breaking. The baby grew. Elvira made a cradle. She made it herself over several evenings, working with a small saw and a drawknife, and a piece of good pine that Harlan brought from the lumber yard in Springer. And when he saw what she was doing, he helped where she let him and watched where she did not. And the result was a solid and well-made thing with turned spindles on the head end that she had figured out from a picture in a book. "Where did you learn to work wood?" he said, the first evening she was at it. "My father's ferry," she said, with the drawknife moving in a long, clean stroke. "Something is always breaking on a ferry. You learn to fix it." He had brought a stool to sit on and watch, which was not something he normally did, but watching Elvira Wells work at something was one of his great pleasures, a pleasure that had not diminished with familiarity but rather increased. "Harlan," she said without stopping the drawknife, "you are staring." "I know." She looked up briefly. There was a warmth in her face that she did not try to conceal. She shook her head once in the way that was not a no and went back to her work. The baby came in late March, a week before the doctor's estimate, which the doctor in Cimarron said was not unusual. It was a fast labor, mercifully, though that was a relative term. The doctor was there, a steady and experienced woman named Dr. Pearl Haskins, who had practiced in the territory for 12 years, and whose manner had the calm of someone who has been through many things and has been made sensible rather than frightened by them. Clara sat in the kitchen with Deke Mossman, both of them playing a card game that neither of them was paying any attention to. Harlan stayed close. He had asked Dr. Haskins if he could stay, and she had looked at him with an assessing look and said, "Most men can't." "I am staying," he said simply, and she had accepted this. He held Elvira's hand through the parts that needed holding and said the things that came to him without planning, that she was doing well, that he was there, that he loved her, because those were the true and immediate things, and she was a woman who dealt in truth. And she held his hand back with a grip that was extremely strong for someone who was not sentimental about much. The baby arrived at 4 in the morning in late March 1885, which meant, as Harlan noted later, that the most significant people of his life had arrived at that particular hour, that threshold between dark and light. It was a boy. Doctor. Haskins set him in Elvira's arms, and Elvira looked at him with an expression that had no precedent in the vocabulary of expressions Harlan had catalogued from her. It was something new, something that was all of her at once, the strength and the softness and the grief that had been carried and the love that had kept walking anyway, all of it present and undivided. She looked up at Harlan, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with both hands pressed together and pressed to his mouth. "Come here," she said. He leaned over and looked at the boy. The boy was red and indignant and very small and undeniably present. "Hello," Harlan said. He said it quietly, the way you say something to a person you are very glad to meet. "Well," Elvira said, "I suppose we should let Clara make her proposal." He laughed, and she smiled, and the lamp on the bedside table was burning, and outside the March sky was beginning at the lowest edge to go from black to the deep dark blue that precedes everything. They named him Samuel. Clara, upon being told, went immediately to the room where her mother was resting and looked at the baby with the critical attention of a person conducting an inspection, and then said, "He is a good size. His fingers are correctly formed. I approve of the name." Deke Mossman came to the door of the room and held his hat and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Graves," to Elvira, and "Congratulations, Mr. Graves," to Harlan. And his face was so unguardedly happy for them that Harlan shook his hand for a long moment and said, "You are a good man, Deke," which made Deke go red and look at the floor and say, "Yes, sir." The spring came in earnest after that, the kind of spring that seems to want to make up for the length of the winter, green and generous and full of birds. Elvira was on her feet within a week, and at the account books within 2, which Dr. Haskins said was excessive, and Harlan agreed with, and neither of them won any argument with her about. She did agree to let Deke handle the supply run to Cimarron for the month of April, which was a concession. Samuel thrived. He grew with the same purposeful efficiency as everything else in his mother's sphere of influence. He had Elvira's dark eyes and Harlan's hands, large and square even in miniature, and a way of looking at the world that was intense and quiet and curious. Clara took her role as older sister with enormous seriousness, instructing Samuel at length on subjects he was not yet remotely equipped to understand: the correct names of all the cattle, the differences between the various species of birds visible from the yard, the rules of 7 different card games. Harlan would come in from the barn sometimes and find Clara sitting beside the cradle talking to the baby with her usual unhurried fluency, and he would stand in the doorway and look at them and then look for Elvira, because the pull toward her was by now so constant and so natural that it had become the organizing principle of how he moved through the space of his own home. In June, Elvira said, "I would like to expand the bunkhouse." He was at the table. "Expand it how?" "Deke needs more room. He has been in that main room for going on 2 years, and it is too small for a grown man's things and a grown man's dignity." He thought about Deke, who never complained about anything, who worked hard and kept to himself and played cards with Clara and had, it was becoming clear, a certain quality of loyalty to this place and these people that went beyond the employment arrangement. "What are you thinking?" he said. "Add 2 more rooms off the east side," she said, "in case we ever need more hands, and it is right to give Deke more space. He has earned it." He looked at her across the table. She was nursing Samuel, who had the single-minded focus of the recently arrived, and she was holding the account ledger in her other hand, which was very much in character. "You are already planning the next 5 years of this ranch," he said. "I have been planning the next 5 years of this ranch since January," she said, without looking up from the ledger. He pressed his lips together against the smile and then let it come because there was no containing it. They broke ground on the bunkhouse addition in July when the dry weather made it practical. He and Deke did most of the framing themselves, with a hired carpenter from Cimarron named Louis Garza, who was excellent at his trade and quick, and who talked to Clara with the patient respect that a certain kind of adult has for children who clearly have something going on, which earned him Elvira's permanent goodwill. The work took 3 weeks. When it was done, Deke moved into the larger room and the 2 new rooms waited, clean and plain, for whatever came next. What came next, as it happened, was a letter from Elvira's younger sister, Marguerite, who was incensed. Louis, and whose husband had died the previous autumn, who was looking at her life and the narrowness of her options in the city, and who had written to Elvira, she said, because Elvira was the person she knew who was most likely to have figured out something true. Elvira read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked out the window for a while. "Your sister," Harlan said. "She is in a difficult position," Elvira said. "She is 30 years old. She has no children. She has a small amount of savings and a great deal of competence that is going to waste in a city that cannot see past the fact that she is a woman without a man." Harlan looked at the letter on the table. "How long since you've seen her?" "6 years, Elvira said. She looked at him. "I want to write to her and ask her to come." He thought about the 2 new rooms at the end of the bunkhouse. He thought about Deke Mossman, who was 30 years old himself, and who had not once but twice in the past month made some excuse to be in the kitchen doorway when Elvira was talking about her sister. "Write to her," he said. Elvira looked at him with the particular attention she gave him when she was measuring something. "It would not be an imposition," she said. "Elvira," he said gently, "this is your home. Ask your sister to come." She looked at him for a moment with something in her eyes that was full and soft and very direct. Then she got up and found the writing paper. Marguerite arrived in September. She was not as quiet as Elvira, but had the same basic quality of not performing herself, of simply being present with an economy of affect that was its own kind of authority. She had brown hair and gray eyes, and she shook Harlan's hand when she got off the stage in Cimarron, with a firmness that made him understand the family clearly. She went to work within 2 days, because that was apparently what women named Wells did, and she found her particular place in the operation in the area of the horses, where she had skill and intuition, and she began reorganizing the tack room with the same systematic energy that Elvira had brought to the supply shed a year and a half before. Deke Mossman found reasons to be near the tack room with extraordinary frequency, beginning in the second week of her arrival. Harlan mentioned this to Elvira one evening after supper. "I know," she said. "She seems to not be discouraging it," he said. "No," Elvira agreed. "She does not seem to be discouraging it. Is she likely to encourage it?" He said. Elvira considered. "My sister is not a person who does things quickly, but she does not do things she does not mean. If she allows him to continue finding reasons to be near the tack room, it means she finds the reasons acceptable." He nodded slowly. "Deke is a good man." "Yes," she said, "he is." She looked up at him. "It is a quality that turns out to be quite important." He held her eyes. "Is it?" he said. "Very important," she said, and the warmth in her voice was doing what it always did to the surface of his skin, which was to remind him very specifically that he was alive. He moved to her and sat beside her on the bench and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, comfortable and settled, with Samuel asleep in the cradle by the stove and Clara's lamp still burning in her room where she was undoubtedly reading past her bedtime, and the house was warm around them and the night outside was the deep dark of early autumn. "Elvira," he said into her hair. She said, "I have something to say." She shifted to look up at him. "Say it." "A year ago November," he said, "I told you that content and alive are not the same thing." He looked at her face in the lamplight. "I want you to know that I am aware of the difference now. Not because 1 year has erased anything, not because it has been uncomplicated, because this life is not uncomplicated and this country does not make any promises, but because I wake up every morning wanting to be here. Because when I am out with the cattle and the afternoon goes long, what I am thinking about is coming back to this table. Because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life, and because I know I do not say that in so many words with any regularity, and I think you deserve to hear it in so many words." She was very still against him. He could feel her breathing. "You give me plenty of words," she said quietly. "Not always the right ones. Harlan." She sat up and looked at him directly with those dark eyes that held everything and asked for honesty. "You opened the door. That night before dawn in the cold, you opened the door and you did not close it again. Not the literal door, though that too, but the other one." She put her hand flat against his chest. "I had been behind closed doors for a long time. I did not know if I was still a person who was capable of being let in, and you just kept the door open." He put his hand over hers where it rested against him. "You walked in yourself," he said. "All I did was step back." She looked at him for a long moment that held the whole of it, the knock before dawn and the cold kitchen, and the long winter and the spring garden, and the word yes in the mud and the cedar chest and the boy in the cradle, and all the ordinary extraordinary days that had assembled themselves into this. "Yes," she said at last, softly, "and I would knock again." He kissed her, there in the lamplight of the kitchen, with the house full and warm and the night outside vast and dark, and the New Mexico territory going on in its uncompromising way all around them, full of its distances and its difficulties and its unearned beauties. October brought the anniversary of that first morning. Harlan was up before dawn, which was not unusual. He had the stove going and the coffee on and the lamp lit when the sky outside was still fully dark. He stood in the kitchen in his stocking feet, holding his cup, and he remembered. He remembered the sound of that knock, the soft, apologetic quality of it. He remembered opening the door and the cold air coming in and the woman on his porch, the frost in her dark hair and the mud on her boots, and the controlled exhaustion of someone who has been holding themselves together through sheer will over a very long stretch. He remembered how he had stepped back from the door and kept it open. He heard her footsteps before he saw her, the familiar sound of her moving through the bedroom, the door, the hallway, the way her presence reorganized the air of a room as she entered it. She came into the kitchen in her nightgown and her wool dressing robe, her hair loose and dark with its threads of silver white, her feet in the flannel slippers Clara had given her for Christmas. And she stopped when she saw the lamp and the coffee waiting and him standing in the middle of the kitchen looking at her. She looked back at him. The dark eyes, the steady, unhurried gaze that he had been the subject of for a year now, and still felt as something specific and new each time. "You are up very early," she said. "1 year ago this morning," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she understood what he was marking, and something moved through her face that was not quite a smile and not quite sorrow and was everything between. "It was cold," she said. "It was. I was afraid you would not open the door," she said. "I stood at the gate for a long time before I came up the porch steps." He had not known that. He thought of her standing at the gate in the dark with the frost settling into her hair, deciding. "I am glad you did," he said. "I was not sure," she said, "if there was anything on the other side of that door. I was not sure if I had enough left to be glad if there was." He crossed the kitchen to her. He stood in front of her and looked at her, this woman who had walked across the dark fields to his door and knocked, who had been careful and honest and present and extraordinary every day since, who had brought her daughter and her accounts ledger and her competence and her grief and her capacity to love into his house and his life, and had made it unrecognizable in the best possible way. He put his hands on either side of her face the way she had taught him by doing it to him first. She put her hands over his. "Well," he said softly. She looked at him, and the smile that came was the full one, the one that had been rare at the beginning and was not rare anymore, the one that held all of her. "There was everything on the other side of that door," she said. He held her face in his hands in the lamplight of the kitchen in the early dark of an October morning, 1 year on. Through the walls of the house he could hear, at the edges, the sounds of the life around them. Samuel stirring in his cradle with the small, restless sounds of a waking baby. Clara turning a page in her room, up early as usual, reading by lamplight. The horses shifting in the barn. Somewhere in the bunkhouse Deke sleeping soundly and Marguerite in the room next to him, and what was beginning quietly between them in its own time. And outside, the New Mexico territory going on in its wide and uncompromising way, the land flat and red and immense, the sky beginning at its very lowest edge to shift from black toward the deep indigo blue that was the first suggestion of morning. And in the kitchen, the lamp burning, the stove warm, the coffee ready. And Elvira Graves, who had been Elvira Wells, who had walked through the dark with frost in her hair and knocked at a stranger's door before dawn, standing in the circle of her husband's hands with her own hands over his and the whole of a real and chosen life around her, looking at him with the clear and steady eyes that held everything. "You opened the door," she said, "and I never want it closed again." "It won't be," he said. "It will never be." And he meant it the way a man means a thing when he has finally understood what he has, when the cold and the dark have taught him enough about warmth and light to make them sacred. He meant it in the way of the cedar chest and the blue quilt, and the names of the cattle and the biscuits made from scratch in the gray morning, and the hands held across the kitchen table, and the ring on her finger, and the boy in the cradle, and the girl reading past her bedtime, and all the ordinary days still coming, all the long and ordinary and irreplaceable days still ahead. The sun came up. It came up over the mesa the way it always did, without announcement, without asking permission, just incrementally there, flooding the land with the particular orange-gold light of a New Mexico autumn morning that makes everything it touches look like it has been lit from inside. Harlan and Elvira stood together in the kitchen and watched it come through the window. Samuel woke fully and announced this with the democratic volume of infancy, and Clara's chair scraped as she got up to attend to him before either parent could get there, because that was what Clara did, that was who she was. "Breakfast," Elvira said, against his shoulder. "Yes," he said. She turned to the stove. He reached past her for the coffee pot. They moved around each other in the kitchen with the ease and knowledge of people who have shared a space long enough that they have mapped each other by heart, and the morning came in fully around them, and the house was warm and full, and everything that had started with a knock in the cold dark before dawn was here now, present and solid and real. Outside the window, the day was wide open. Inside the kitchen, so was the door, and neither of them was going anywhere. Deke Mossman did ask Marguerite Wells to walk with him that following spring, and she did say yes, in her own time, in the way she did everything, which was deliberately and without apology. They were married the spring after that, in the same church in Cimarron with the same Reverend Cole and the same quality of sunlight through the windows, and Elvira stood beside her sister at the altar with Clara at her side and Samuel, now 14 months old and ambulatory, and of strong opinions, held firmly in his father's arms through the entire ceremony, with the exception of one brief interval when he escaped and had to be retrieved from the area of the flower arrangement. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not recklessly, but honestly, the way things grow when they are tended with consistent care. The herd expanded. The north fence line held. The kitchen garden continued its productive relationship with the ledger in which Elvira tracked every seed and every yield. Clara grew into a young woman who went to school in Cimarron through all her grades, and then, at 16, began talking about the school in Santa Fe, where there was a program for training teachers, because she had decided that teaching was the thing she wanted to do with the combination of patience and intelligence, and the willingness to repeat herself that she had been born with. Elvira sat with her and looked at the information about the Santa Fe school and then looked at her daughter and thought about a ferry crossing in Missouri and a girl who learned to read numbers like a language. "You should go," Elvira said. Clara looked at her. "You will not miss me." "Every day," Elvira said. "You should still go." And Clara went. And she wrote letters back that were detailed and vivid and characteristically Clara, full of observations and assessments, and the names of 3 different people she had decided were worth knowing. And she came home for Christmas and in the summer. And she taught at the school in Cimarron after she finished and lived in the small house at the edge of town that she rented with a friend from Santa Fe. And Samuel grew into a boy who was his father's shadow in the fields and his mother's sharpness at the table, who had the dark Wells eyes and the Graves jaw, and an easy, unself-conscious laugh that seemed to fill whatever room he was in. He learned to ride before he fully learned to walk, or so it felt. He named every animal on the property within reason, and argued effectively for the retention of any that Harlan suggested might be sold, and he won more of those arguments than was probably economically wise, but the ranch could afford a certain margin of sentiment. Marguerite and Deke had a daughter in 1887, a red-cheeked and formidably loud baby they named Frances, and she grew up in the room at the end of the expanded bunkhouse, which had by then been upgraded to something that was more properly a small cottage, with her own proper window and a garden bed outside it where Marguerite grew lavender. The land changed slowly around them. The territory was moving toward statehood in the long conversation that would not conclude until 1912, but even in those years of the 1880s, the thing that was coming could be felt in the growing towns and the new roads and the stage lines, and the telegraph wires that went up along the major routes. Harlan watched it with a practical eye, and was neither sentimental about what was changing nor indifferent to what was being lost. He held both truths as a man holds 2 things that are both true at once, which is the only honest way to hold them. One evening in the autumn of 1888, 5 years from the morning of the knock, Harlan and Elvira sat on the porch as they often did when the evening was clear and the work of the day was settled. The sun was going down over the mesa in the spectacular fashion it had at that time of year, the sky going from blue to orange to deep rose to the first faint stars. Samuel was inside with Marguerite. Deke was in the barn. The land was quiet in the way of evenings. Elvira had her hands loose in her lap and her face turned west, reading the sunset with the same attention she brought to everything, that quality of really looking. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. "About the fact that I am 38 years old," she said. He looked at her. The frost in her hair was more pronounced now than it had been that first morning, threading through the dark in wider swaths of silver white, and it was beautiful in a way that he did not have words for that were adequate. And, he said, "And I have lived more in the last 5 years than in all the years before," she said. "And I do not mean that as a slight against what came before. Thomas was a good man and Kansas was a good life. But this," she looked at the sunset, she looked at him, "this is the one I get to keep." He put his arm around her and she came against his side with the easy settlement of long custom. "We both get to keep it," he said. She put her hand on his chest, flat and certain over the steady drum of his heart. "Yes," she said, "we do." The last star to appear that evening appeared over the mesa at the exact moment the last light of the sun went below the horizon, that precise threshold where what is ending and what is beginning are both present at once, the same threshold that is always the real beginning of anything worth having. And the lamp burned in the window of the house behind them, warm and steady, against whatever dark came next. And the door was open. It was always open. It would always be.